Labour has been in power for a year, so what do the public think about its performance? Well, the British Social Attitude Survey is published today, and I'm going to be speaking to the Venerable Sir John Curtice about it, asking him our attitudes about the state, the NHS, and which party is most in touch with public opinion.
Essentially, what Reform have done is to get back from the Conservatives, that socially conservative, pro-Brexit section of our electorate that voted Conservative in 2019. They have basically now virtually all disappeared into the hands of Reform. And Nigel Farage will say, well, I gave them to Boris Johnson and now I've got them back.
First off, the government says that the economy is doing well, that growth is steady and inflation is under control. But how do voters actually feel?
Well, the truth is that one can still very clearly see the legacy of the 2019 to 2024 Parliament, which of course is one in which there was very little economic growth, living standards didn't really improve, and where there was a cost of living crisis. So one question we've asked now pretty regularly, really ever since the financial crash, ask people, look, how are you doing on your income? Are you living comfortably? Are you getting by? Or are you struggling? And we've got 26% of people who now say they are struggling. That is the same as it was in the previous survey in 2023. But both those figures are a record high. It used to be not much more than around 1 in 5. Meanwhile, the proportion of people who are saying they're living comfortably, which used to be over 40%, it's now down to 34%. So one can see very clearly that as a society, we are, more of us at least, are struggling. Few of us are thinking that we are financially well cushioned. And then you can also see, as you might anticipate, when we ask people, well, do you think your income has been keeping up with prices over the course of the last 12 months? 2/3 of people say, no, it hasn't done. And so again, clearly the impact of the cost of living crisis in particular is there. So certainly as compared with the last decade or so, we are feeling financially less secure. We are finding the cost of living more of a problem. And that is certainly one of the problems that Labour is trying to address. And insofar that that is one of their priorities, they're clearly focusing in the right policy space.
So that collapse in confidence is linked to the pandemic, not necessarily to domestic politics. But can you draw a correlation between COVID and the lockdown and people's changing attitudes towards their personal finances?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly the cost of living crisis and the legacy of that, which of course is partly a consequence of the pandemic and the impact on supply chains, and partly, not least, the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war on the price of energy, already relatively high in the UK, now even higher. But one can see during the pandemic that attitudes or people's perceptions of how they were dealing with their financial circumstances were becoming more pessimistic. So it's one of those things that the public are hoping that the new government were going to deal with. It's not necessarily something that as yet they necessarily blame Labour for, although, I mean, opinion polling evidence certainly suggests that people so far are not convinced that the new government have made much progress. But certainly in focusing on that issue, Labour are in the right place. The reasons why they feel the way they do lie before the 2024 election.
Has something similar happened when it comes to satisfaction with the NHS? Is there a similar story there?
There is an even more striking story when it comes to the NHS, which of course is the area where the government has proposed to spend more, where it's trying to focus on getting wait lists down. And again, it diagnosed the problem the public wants to reach very well. Satisfaction with their health service is now down at a record low. We have only got just over 1 in 5 of us are satisfied with the health service. It was running at 60% in 2019 before the pandemic hit. And of course, what's happened in the wake of the pandemic was we decided not to proceed with a great deal of elective surgery. That's the surgery that people get booked to do for because it's not immediately urgent, as opposed to you break your leg or whatever, or have a heart attack and immediately get taken into A&E. It's not just the health service. It's also, by the way, social care. We've only got 13% of people who are satisfied with social care. It was 37% in 2019. That, of course, is something on which the government has focused much less, but is evidently still also a public concern. But certainly managing to turn around the health service is very much something people want to see happen. And we are seeing around just over 2/3 of people saying, despite the fact we are already spending a lot more on the health service than we were before the pandemic, and it's a gradually increasing proportion of UK government expenditure, that we still got just over 2/3 of people saying we're not spending enough, which is probably a cry for, could we please make it better? And obviously, therefore, if you say to people we should be spending more, they're inclined to say there certainly isn't much sign yet. There's a little bit at the edges. There isn't much sign as yet that the high level of dissatisfaction with the health service is leading people to question the way in which we run it, the way in which we fund it. There's a little bit. There's now just under 1 in 5 of us who are saying, well, maybe it shouldn't all be funded through taxes. And that's particularly noticeable amongst an element of those who are dissatisfied, but it's still very, very much a minority view.
I just want to repeat one of those statistics because I think it's so striking, which is that in 2019, 60% of us were satisfied with the NHS, and now it's down to 21%. That suggests that actually the Tories had improved the NHS by 2019 such that most of the public really were happy with it by that point.
No, that's the truth is that satisfaction with the health service rose quite remarkably during the years of New Labour, who spent a lot more money on it, and they got the waiting times down. What is true, however, to acknowledge the point that you're not unreasonably making, is that satisfaction with the health service, having risen to record highs in the latter years of New Labour, the claims that the government was imposing austerity and that this was adversely affecting the health service, that didn't really have much purchase on the public. So satisfaction with the health service largely survived the so-called Cameron-Osborne austerity.
Right, but you can see there is some irony.
But it didn't survive. But it did not survive the pandemic. But of course, but again, the reason is very clear. The reason why we were dissatisfied with the health service in the latter days of the Thatcher major government, it was because of high levels of waiting lists. Right. The reason why satisfaction with the health service improved under New Labour is they got waiting lists down. They hadn't increased that much under when the Conservatives returned, but the pandemic has seen waiting lists rise to levels that we have never previously seen. And that is the problem that the public are looking to Labour to solve.
So most people's measure of how well it's doing is waiting lists. That
seems to be the crucial metric. Yes.
I do think there is some irony that in the years in which the Tories were accused of cutting funding, satisfaction was high, and now that funding for the NHS has actually been dramatically increased, satisfaction has collapsed. But of course,
and of course, if we're just playing party politics here, it collapsed under the Conservatives. I mean, right. I'm not suggesting it's their fault, right?
Yeah.
The point is, the pandemic happened. Now, I think there is a debate now out there about whether or not the UK shut down on elective care to a great extent that was necessary. Other countries did not necessarily do so to the extent. So certainly one of the decisions that was made about how to handle the pandemic certainly contributed significantly to the problem. And that's probably going to be one of the things we're going to be debating for quite a while about whether or not we did or did not need to do that to the extent that we actually did.
We've talked about spending. Let's talk about how willing the British people are to pay taxes to cover it.
Yeah.
Are we a left-wing country when it comes to tax? Are we people who are just desperate to hand our money over to the state?
At the moment, we're not desperate to hand over our money to the state, but arguably we are perhaps keener than historically we might have expected to be. So let me explain. Okay, right. So one of the things that, I mean, again, for a lot of the loose talk about austerity, of course, the legacy of the last Parliament was the biggest expansion of the state since 1945. Both taxation and spending rose to record levels, and taxation is still on course to rise to spending levels, despite Labour's commitment not to raising the rates of taxation. And that, of course, was a consequence of the fact that the state intervened into the labour market, paid lots of people's wages, put a lot of money into the health service in the wake of that, was subsidizing everybody's energy bills for a while, et cetera, et cetera. The state expanded very considerably, and it's still higher now than it was before the pandemic. Now, normally what we would expect when the state expands, we expect the public to start saying, hang on, that's too much. It's time certainly to be stopping these increases and either holding things where they are or actually reducing them. And that is certainly what happened in the wake of New Labour. So one of the ironies about New Labour, I've already talked about how people got more satisfied with the health service, but that came at a cost. And then eventually people said, well done, thanks very much. The health service is better, the schools are better. Could you now please stop taxing us so much? And that is what we call in the trade a thermostatic reaction, that the public have a sense of how big they think the state should be, and they start to react either to say we've got too much or too little if we move too much away from that. The interesting thing, at least until our most recent survey, is that despite that big increase in the state, we were still getting around 50% of people saying we should be spending more, we should be increasing taxes and spending more on things like health and education. It has now begun to fall away. That figure has now fallen down to 40%, but it is still higher than it was in 2010 when Labour were leaving office. Then it was 31%, even though the level of taxation is still higher now than it was then. So I think the jury is still out as to whether or not the experience of the pandemic with the state rescuing the labour market has meant that our appetite for a bigger state is now perhaps a little bit sharper than it once was. And I don't think we'll know this for another 5 years or not. But certainly I think it's also fair to say that, the other kind of point that comes out is we think that basically taxes for people on low incomes are too high, and that is more the case than was the case in 2016, where we're also inclined to that view of people on middle incomes. That said, about 44% of us think that taxes for those for people on high incomes are too low, and that figure is still higher than it was in 2016. So, now we can interpret this various ways. We can say, well, it's the usual thing of the public wanting to have more things, but they want somebody else to pay, and that's not an unreasonable observation. But equally, I think the truth is where we're going to end up as a society in terms of the size of our state and what the public feel about that is one of the interesting questions that we'll see during the lifetime of this parliament.
The government has set about reforming disability benefits. Do you see any evidence from your research that there is sympathy for that, or do people still think that the disabled should get good care?
The answer is yes and no. So the yes bit is that we've been asking people on a regular basis, again over the last decade or so, should, actually over longer than that, should benefits for people with disabilities be increased or not? And the proportion of people who say it should be increased is now 45%, which is still quite a big number, but it is a record low. It's the first time it's been below 50%. It used to be around 60%, even 70%. So there is, to that extent at least, seemingly a recognition by the public that maybe we are now doing better for people with disabilities than was the case 20 years ago. That said, it is only 11% of us who say we should actually cut it. And if we then turn to the particular controversy that the government certainly kind of finds itself involved in, which is essentially an argument that says that actually access to these benefits is just too easy, that the criteria are not demanding enough, and as a result we have got people of working age in record numbers either on long-term sickness or on disability, and that we need to try to reduce that because it's too easy for people to get these, and as a result, the government argues it's a disincentive to go into work. Now, what we discover, however, is that yes, there are around 29% of us who think it's too easy for people to be able to claim disability benefit, but equally, there are 29% of us who think that it's too difficult. And to that extent, at least, the public is evenly divided. And of course, it won't surprise you to hear that Labour supporters are more or less 2-to-1 inclined to the view that it's too difficult rather than it's too easy. So you can see why this issue is something which the way in which the government is arguing isn't necessarily something that resonates with public opinion. One should also say, by the way, however, I mean, I referred to social care either. Of course, another big decision this government made, which has caused much less controversy, was the decision yet again to kick the can down the road on social care and the idea that there should be a lifetime limit. Actually, we discover that, I already said, low levels of satisfaction. So basically around 2/3 of us either think the government should be paying everybody's social care, or there should be the lifetime limit. So it does look as though the idea of there being a lifetime limit on care is something that's relatively popular, still is relatively popular. It's something that Labour have decided to delay. Yet again, we've got a commission. But I think we should be aware that this is another area where the public aren't necessarily in tune with what the government have decided.
Final question. Looking at all of this data, which party do you think right now is best pitching itself towards this public?
The answer to is that we are looking at a deeply divided public, and a public that is now politically divided not simply between left and right, which is the traditional way of dividing it, but rather between social liberals and social conservatives. These are people who are different views on the so-called culture wars issues. So attitudes towards immigration, transgender, etc. So the party that is succeeding as a result of the rise of that second dimension in our politics is Reform. Reform, our data show this, the polling data show this. We're able to show very clearly that the thing that above all demarcates and identifies people who voted Reform last year, people who, when we went back and did another extra survey this spring, again, they are people who are socially conservative. The folk who are concerned about immigration. The folk who think we should be proud of empire rather than the history about slavery. The folk who don't think that we should be allowing trans men to use women's toilets. And because of the collapse of the brand reputation of the Conservatives, essentially what Reform have done is to get back from the Conservatives that socially conservative, pro-Brexit section of our electorate that voted Conservative in 2019. They have basically now virtually all disappeared into the hands of Reform. And Nigel Farage will say, well, I gave them to Boris Johnson and now I've got them back. So you can certainly see how Reform are doing well in this space. Conversely, you can also see the difficulties that Labour have, because Labour are trying to bridge both divides. They don't want to be too socially liberal, but the trouble you can therefore also see is that actually Labour are at risk of losing votes to the Greens amongst more socially liberals, but equally also Labour are, to some degree, though not to anything like the same extent as the Conservatives, losing some ground to Reform. So the problem for Labour is to avoid being eroded in both directions. In the case of the Conservatives, the problem is simple. They're just losing head over heels to Reform. So Reform at the moment have managed to organise the socially conservative end of our society, and also that their voters, unlike UKIP, do tend to be to the right economically. So they've clearly carved out a space for them. It's a niche market, but in our fragmented politics, 30% is enough to potentially put you well ahead. What I think isn't as yet clear is whether or not who is going to be able to bring together the left and the socially liberal end of our spectrum. Labour, being in government, are finding that more difficult. The Greens have made some progress, but nothing like the same kind of progress in Reform. And the Liberal Democrats are still bouncing around. So at the moment, the simplest answer to your question is Reform, but whether that will remain the case, another 4 years to the next election.
Sir John Curtice, thank you very much.
You're welcome.